Hi, welcome everyone to another AJ Spec Live webinar. I'm Rob Wilson, Architecture Editor at the Architects Journal. AJ Specification Live is a series of free AJ events with talks that provide in-depth information on design and specification, building materials and construction methods. This morning, the talks will focus on the design and specification of walls, ceilings and partitions, exploring this through 3 case studies. These will be presented by speakers from 3 different practices who will be focusing on their approach to designing and specifying and on the materials and products they specified. So we're very happy to welcome, as our speakers this morning, Phil Coffey, Director of Coffey Architects, who will be speaking on their apartment block scheme in London. Ian Whittle, Senior Associate, and Ian Stevenson, Associate at Faulkner Browns Architects, who will be exploring their Lower Mountjoy Teaching and Learning Centre in Durham. And Richie Tuthill, Associate Director at Jonathan Hendry Architects, who will be talking about their Holton Studios project in Lincolnshire. And I'll be inviting each of them to talk for about 10 minutes about each of these schemes. And then I'll kick off a short panel discussion by asking them a few questions and open this up, of course, to your questions coming out of their presentations. So to submit questions, you can submit questions throughout the webinar. And to do this, just go to the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A function, and then type in your question. So before I introduce you to our first speaker, I would like to thank our sponsor, Equitone. Without their support, this event could not take place, so thank you very much to them. So I think without much more ado, I'd like to welcome and to ask Phil Coffey of Coffey Architects to talk about the apartment block scheme. Phil.
Morning. Can you see my screen? Yep. Morning, everybody. Thanks to the AJ for inviting me to take part in the webinar this morning. I will rattle through this. We've got 10 minutes. I believe the client is online. So hi, John, if you're there. This is our project apartment block. We called it apartment block because it's made of blocks and it's an apartment, but it's not a whole apartment block. It's just one apartment. Small but beautifully made. I'm going to see if I can, there we are, it's moving now. So it's Kingsway Place, it's in Clerkenwell. The actual project itself is in the bottom left 3 windows from where you look. We also did Hidden House, which is a project which got shortlisted for House of the Year, which is around the corner on the right. What I really love about this building is the patina of the building and the variation in the material and the stone on the front of the building. It's a listed building. It faces south, this front elevation. It was not very good for the school kids in the past, probably overheated, and so it's something to think about when we're designing the building. This was the existing ground floor, number 4 being a bedroom at the back with a staircase cutting across, with a bathroom to the rear, kitchen kind of half and half in living space, with an entrance area from the east with the 3 large windows to the south. The new layout, John and Karen, who live in this home, don't have that many visitors, and they're very lovely people, but they tend to keep people away. And so in the back bedroom here, it can be used as a dining room, so we bring light into that back space. The kitchen is squeezed into that space as well, and the bathroom. And the front living space is double height space with the staircase, which then creates a threshold for the entry from the east. I'll rattle through the plans because we want to get to materials, don't we? This was the existing upper floor with the staircase again, which faces a wall as you go up. There's a Romeo and Juliet balcony where John used to do his work, and the bedroom above. The new layout extends the mezzanine. The staircase moved off to the side. Then shutters and screens kind of make this interstitial space, which is the home office, which then looks over the void, bedroom behind, and the void to the front. There's the extended mezzanine in the section, staircase at the back, bedroom with the living stroke bedroom below. So in essence, it's just one large piece of joinery that sits within a large piece of stone made out of timber. We're really interested in light at Coffey Architects, and in essence, the 2 screens bring the light, or the perception of light, deeper and deeper into the plan by repeating the pattern and the idea of linen screens, black outlines between oak paneling. So these are the little culprits that we made the project out of. 30,000 hand-cut timber blocks, precision cut on site by a lovely man. There was a master block which was used so that you could run your finger across. End grain is very, very difficult to sand. I've just been told, I didn't know this, but these timber blocks were used throughout Clerkenwell a long time ago for loading their yards and other such like, probably for the softness. I'm not entirely sure why, but this is why it's contextual in the area. In terms of using it internally, one of the ideas that we always come back to is tone, light, presence, reflection. Khan once said about the Kimball Art Gallery, I'm not trying to compare the two, but something that, a building that I love. The travertine and the marble sit right next to each other, two very different materials. However, their tone and their reflective factor are very similar. So you get this kind of consistency of palette. And that's something we're trying to achieve here with the existing green glazed tiles to the front, the variation on the, sorry, that's a van outside my office, if you can hear that. Variation on the floor with the oak panels, and then the veneer on the walls. And you can see the screens that now cover the windows for privacy and for light behind. So if you get those tones and those different materials and put them together, and then you use screens to make pattern through shadow and light, you can get that tone and that saturation and then fuse them all together with shadows and direct sunlight and percolated light and translucent light, which is something that we're super interested in. It's that gap between the aperture and the surfaces within the building. So the specification of the materials isn't necessarily just about the material itself, it's about its reflection, its tone, its presence, how it responds to light, how it takes light, how it sucks light. The blocks themselves, when they were cut, were placed into buckets, because obviously if you were to cut one length, 60 by 60 mil length, cut it and put it all in the same place, you get a patchwork. So we had to separate them out and make sure we mixed it correctly. There's linen space between the shutters against the windows to make translucent light, more milky light with more transparent light from above. When there's no light in there, you can see the saturation, which can be seen here. We like tall spaces at Coffee Architect, zenith light, and we also like long spaces. Somebody once told me the only job of an architect is to make the space that you're designing feel bigger than it was, which is, I think, to a certain extent true. The floor is finished in 10 cans we used, Osmo, Polix, oil, raw, 3 coats. By moving the staircase, when you're moving downstairs or upstairs, you have a long view, like I was saying, long view and tall view, make spaces feel bigger. With carpet inside the bedroom, it's always nice to put your feet onto carpet when you get up in the morning, and then oak outside that also helps save a few bob. This is upstairs. Somebody once told me that once you've sketched out a layout, you should always put a grid on a plan. A 60 by 60 grid is a particularly fine grid to put on a plan. But the wonderful thing about putting a grid on is then you actually start to detail to 60 mil and draw to 60 mil for layout. And then you find little nooks and crannies, pockets, desks, where screens should sit. So the material itself helps you in the wider context of laying out the initial outline plans, which I find an enjoyable relationship between material and function and layout. If you go to Alvar Aalto's experimental house in Finland, it's with that beautiful elevation that I'm sure we know, which is the different brickworks, and there's a line of tiles across the top of the roof, which is slightly pitched. If you climb up the hill, you recognise that you just put one line of tiles on the side to make it look like the whole roof is tiled. So if Alvar Aalto can cheat a little, so can we. So here you can see the steps, and the steps are made to look like they are part of the 60 mil by 60 mil blocks, in essence giving it a strength and a robustness and a visual kind of integrity that isn't necessarily there. These are 30 mil deep planks, which are then mitered on the corner, but it gives, along with a handrail, it makes the whole thing feel very, very, very solid, and it's just clad over a softwood frame. This is a view from the bedroom, again looking through to light. Quite prescient, I think. We're all working from home a bit more now, and I think through all of our projects we're going to be looking to make beautiful places for people to sit. And of course here, home working, looking out over the double height space through the screens with screens behind you is a beautiful little interstitial space and a small space which is born of the 60 mil grid and the craft and the finish of making a place like this. This isn't actually the space that we designed. I think it's on the other corner, but it is from the school. The steelwork's in a slightly different place. But again, you can see it's just a big bit of stone with a bit of joinery in it. And there's something about the joy, the simplicity and the function which we enjoyed in making. The parquet floor was existing in our scheme when we took out the existing finishes, but it was in a terrible condition, but it still sits there below the plywood upon which then the oak blocks are sat. Should mention it's white European oak, which is one of the more sustainable oaks that you can get, or timbers. I've got something to tell John, that we found a penny when the finishes were taken out of the building. That penny is a very beautiful thing. So it was laid just on the bottom corner here of the entrance. And although it's very difficult to sand end grain, you have to do it once or twice just to get the levels correct. And of course, the penny was laid down with all its tarnish, and then the contractor got somebody in to sand the floor, and he then went on and sanded the penny too. So the penny looked like a brand new penny that was made last week. So John doesn't know this, but sorry, John, but we used a bit of baking soda and some Coke to bring that back with the tarnish. So the smallest detail, super important to us in every project. And this is one of my favorite photographs of the project, which I'm nearly finished talking about, which is east light coming in, not direct sunlight. It gives a sense of a place to go to. It draws you into that space. It's quarter cut veneer, so it's more calm than a crown cut veneer, where you can sit and enjoy feeling like you're in a solid piece of timber. The panels the ceiling was made from panels when applied. Then the blocks were added after they were screwed in, and then EnviroGraph was added to prevent spread of flame. It took a month to do that ceiling. There's a detail of it, simple blocks with a veneer coming down at the front on a softwood back. And that's a shameless plug for my photography website, philcoffey.com, coffeearchitects.com, and our new website, coffeehomes.com. And I think that's exactly 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Phil. And we'll probably go straight on to the next presentation. So I'll ask Ian Whittle and Ian Stevenson of Faulkner Brown Architects, who are going to be talking about the Lower Mountjoy Centre in Durham. So, yeah, I'll pan over to you.
Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that and hear me. I'll assume so and carry on from here. So a bit of a change of scale here. We were appointed around about 2016 to produce a new master plan for Durham University. And really that was about, for the university, transforming the kind of the student experience, both in terms of how they teach and the services that they provide, but also substantially growing by probably around about 30% over the next 10 years. So there were a number of projects that were critical to support those objectives, and a new teaching and learning centre at the Mountjoy part of the estate was the first of those projects to come forward. It's located on a site next to St Mary's College. On the photograph there, you just see the edge of the college on the buildings on the left. Part of the college is listed. Immediately above the building, as shown in that photograph, is the Durham City Conservation Area. And obviously what you can see in the distance there is the peninsula in Durham with the castle and the cathedral, which is a World Heritage Site. So in terms of the constraints, that there were substantial heritage concerns that we had to address. And I think as well, the other thing was what was required was around about 8,500 square meters of space. That's a big building for the site that was identified. So we had to really reconcile all of those contextual issues with this very large building in quite a prominent location. It was completed in September 2019, so in theory it's coming up to a year of operation, but of course that's been slightly disrupted, and in effect the building's been closed down since April. So I think it'll have there'll be a longer period of reflection on how it's operating. The construction cost was in the order of £25 million, and we designed the building up to RIBA stage 3. The university appointed Galliford Try as main contractors through their framework, and they brought in their own design team, and we stayed on the university side and really worked in parallel with Space, who were Galliford's architects, to really refine and develop the detail. So in terms of the form of the building, I guess the sort of the kind of focus of the architectural strategy was really in developing a building which responded to all of those contextual constraints, but also enabled the quite a wide range of functions that the building needed to provide. So specific types of teaching space to support the ways in which the university wanted to teach in the future, cafe, social and amenity space, and a very large requirement for learning commons space, which is not something that Durham's done a great deal of in the past. The college has really provided spaces for students to study. So we developed a 15 by 18 plan module, which really responded to all of the various requirements for teaching spaces. And we developed a plan which located all of those teaching spaces at the lower floors of the building, and sat a large scale learning commons across the whole of the upper floor. So that module we then rotated and configured in a number of different ways, and the 3D printing models that you see in the middle there were some of the experiments we did with different roof forms, with different orientations of the blocks. And one of the key steps was really to remove one of those blocks in the centre to create an enclosed top-lit courtyard, which is really the main orientation space within the building. The block on the right there is that's one of our concept models, which I've actually got in front of me here, that really went to the next level of detail on a typical module. And essentially what we established was a brick box which had a window elevation and a more blank gable elevation, capped then with a traditional seam zinc roof, that's then sliced off to give a triangular roof light, which provides the light into the deeper top floor learning spaces. So that was really the kind of the key move in developing the form and the organisational strategy for the building. Within the teaching spaces at the lower levels, there's a wide variety of sizes of rooms, but essentially, coming back to Phil's point about grids, we had a very consistent grid that was derived from the opening pattern on the elevations, which ran through all of the ceilings and the floor finishes internally and informed the space planning. So assembling those modules on the site gave us a building which is visible above the tree line from the conservation area and from the World Heritage Site. So that clearly placed importance on the roof form. And the key thing really was, viewed from a distance, it breaks down the scale of that, what could have been a continuous horizontal roof line, into something that's more of the scale of the St Mary's College that sits behind. And in that photo, you can see the glazed courtyard in the centre, and that has thin film photovoltaics integrated into the glazing, which obviously generate electricity, but also provide some shading into the spaces either side. And internally, within the courtyard, that kind of aesthetic, that materiality of the external elevations is expressed so that very much reads as an empty volume. Each of the brick modules is distinct. They don't overlap where they interface, so there's kind of a double structural zone along each elevation. So this space very much reads as where a module has been removed. And that's really the focal space for the cafe at the ground floor, teaching rooms largely at the middle floor, and then the learning commons, which you see on the right hand side. The coffer of the roof obviously expressed internally, and Ian will talk a little bit more about how we did that. You can see on the image there the deep thresholds between each of the modules that were created by this effectively a double liner structure, and how we use that to kind of order some of the furniture and fit out and layouts within the space. And each of these triangular roof lights, which was lined out in timber panelling, informed a different bespoke piece of furniture, forming the centerpiece to each bay. And one of those is shown on in the image on the right there. So each space has a bespoke piece of furniture at its center that provides a slightly different function. Excuse me. So at that point, I'll hand over to Ian. We'll talk about how we realised that and delivered that in terms of the materiality and the products and the process.
So initially, back at stage 3, we looked at, with Turner and Townsend, all the different options for the roof, for the facade and floor finishes. And the university was very keen to look at the life cycle of the building and limit any maintenance they could. We went down several different options for roof covering, but because of the visual impact was very important, it pushed us down a zinc route very early on in the process. The options for zinc were obviously a standard zinc roof and then a foul zinc roof, but as you can see from the costings and the life cycle of costings we did, that the zinc roof itself actually across the whole life of the building put that at the forefront, and that was the material we went down almost immediately for the roof on the building. When we got to the roof setting out itself, it was complicated to say the least. We had a lot of meetings with space just to go through the detail and setting it out and how it would all work, because as you can see from the image there, the coffer itself is dropped, so it isn't paralleled in normally, so you don't have the same spaces in each void on each side. Because all the sides are different angles, it equates to different spaces between the roof structure and then the final finish internally. That led to, the M&E had to be really, really integrally designed. The structural connections were critical to make sure everything fitted within those zones. The reason for this was, as Ian mentioned before, because we had this space below with the furniture, to get everything to line through, the roof light, the hole in the coffer, and then the furniture below, it couldn't simply be paralleled in. So that's why everything had to drop down vertically to achieve this internal face on each coffer. Now, each coffer is identical, other than it gets mirrored. So once you've got the setting out and the detailing for one sorted, theoretically, it runs through the rest of the building. There were some challenges on site when we got to site, just in terms of the setting out, but I think that was more just to do with the explaining of it and how we dropped the coffer was dropped, and once that was understood, it was fairly seamless to get everything running and get everything moving. So the roof itself, just got some images here. It's actually just a standard zinc standard seam sheet with mineral wool insulation on a plywood deck. You can see from the structure here, it's very complicated connection details at all the different points. As Ian mentioned, we've got double structure in each point of where one coffer meets another. This led to detailing issues with because the roofs are at different angles, they all intersect the main flat roof of the gutters at different heights. So there was different details in all of those locations. The gutters become wider in between the coffers, depending on which side faces which side. So it was a very complicated detailing intent, but it managed to get realised on site, which is great for us. Internally, the idea was we wanted a monolithic space throughout. Initially, that was intended to be a sprayed acoustic finish, but due to the programme constraints, just because you have to almost block these coffers off every time that we wanted to complete one, we decided to go down a rigid tone route. So this was a perforated board. The perforations were selected so that there was no linear perforations because of the changes in the coffer angles. The detailing had to be more precise. There was shadow gaps had to be introduced. There was edges on the plasterboard trims had to be introduced, just to allow us to get it to look as monolithic as we possibly could, but still staying within the original design intent. In terms of the walls, those were just standard British Gypsum IWL wall liners. But you can see on the image that Ian mentioned before, the walls become quite thick in between the spaces, and it gives that definition between each of the coffers. And that's just what the final sort of image in this area, which shows the furniture below, the roof light above, and then the delineation between the spaces. And I think that's us on our 10 minutes, I think. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ian. That's great. And thank you, Ian, as well. I'll now ask Richie Tuftle, Jonathan Hendry Architects, to talk about their Halton Studios project.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. There we go. Okay, so the Halton Studios project, it's located in a small business park on the edge of the village of Halton-le-Clay, near Grimsby in Lincolnshire. There's a few images on the screen of the
I seem to have lost your sound, Richie. I don't know if you're... Oh, we seem to have lost Richie for a short while. See if he's... Just wait for Richie to reconnect back. I'll just ask a couple of questions. Phil, can you hear me? Can you unmute as well? Sorry.
We're new to this, obviously, Rob. Sorry.
Yes, I don't know. There's obviously some connection. I was going to ask about the apartment block scheme. Your use of the brick block, the wood blocks throughout on the ceiling, and right in a way throughout the whole, as like a finish throughout. I'm interested in your thinking behind that. Why sort of take it up to the ceiling, and also whether the blocks were the same. Did you use the same block throughout? What was the spec, or was it for the flooring?
The same. You can buy blocks, but actually it was a cost-saving exercise. It was cheaper to actually chop them up ourselves than it was to buy them separately. And we've always found, we started off doing very small residential projects, and now we're doing much larger things. But we still enjoy doing the smaller projects. And I think one of the things in smaller projects, and actually as you get to bigger projects, is the kind of keeping to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 materials makes spaces feel bigger, just makes it feel more consistent. And also I think it enables us as a practice to kind of get our heads around how to craft that individual material. So, you know, the British Film Institute Library used mesh. Here we use wood block. We use CNC cut aluminium at the Science Museum. We've got other projects now where we're using black concrete, which is like our most important. We're using slate. So I guess we use them. So it's kind of, on one level, it's the selfish architecture practice thing, because we like to explore materials, work with contractors. I should have mentioned that the contractor who built that project we've worked with now he built my house 15, 16 years ago. So we still work with the same guy. The client is a friend who I met actually at Kingsway Place about 8-10 years ago. So projects like this, you know, if you can get your head around one material and really explore it, and really kind of, you know, the guy who makes this kind of strokes the timber, you know, that's the kind of architecture I love making, craft, and then bringing a little bit of our knowledge about light and bringing those things together. So I guess it's about, instead of expanding thought, actually getting down and researching something and responding. And I think particularly in that, in this project, which I've been lucky enough to spend some time in, the weight and the consistency and the sense of it being cleaved, in essence carved to its natural grain, is something that gives a real feeling about the space, which I think is really important in architecture. It's not just necessarily about, we're talking about the technical nature and the aesthetic of it today, but actually when you're in these spaces, you can really sense the warmth and the history. So there's a good balance between technology, history, experience, which then, in this case, John can really enjoy, and John and Karen can really enjoy living in. I mean, architecture is about feeling, I think, before thought, and I think materials go a long way to helping with that.
Great, thank you. I just see we've got a question in about, just for you, Phil, just saying about, could you tell us something about the cost? I don't know, the cost of the project? I don't know if you can, maybe.
John probably knows better than I do. And do you know what? Do you know, that's the one question that I was supposed to find out this morning. Yeah. So Tarek, my sincere apologies, but I actually don't know what the cost was. What I can say is that no project that we've ever done has had an open budget. And John, whilst being a patron of architecture, we're now working on another house with him, it doesn't have an endless checkbook. And for instance, the carpet is a value engineered. The fact that we use blocks that we cut on site that were cheaper than buying blocks otherwise, and then also you can mix and match the way it goes. The fact that it's a softwood background. Every stage of the project, cost is considered. And I think it might be on. It might actually be in the AJ, Rob. It might actually be in your magazine what the cost was.
Might well be.
I'm afraid. This is something I fail you, Tarek. I'm sorry.
I'm just having a look. Not sure.
If John could speak,
I think it's undisclosed actually in the magazine, but but maybe also I just wanted to ask, which is also a question I can ask the Ians as well. But as I said, you're talking about the use of the grid, or at least a grid, as a sort of design tool, and how that sort of came out of the materials. And then maybe after you've talked about that, if Ian and Ian, you could talk about that, because I was interested in your module, because in a way, on a much larger scale, how this idea of a sort of grid or module is a tool to design.
I think it's a really interesting question in architecture. Is that I think as computer working on computer has come forward, especially in 3D, and we design in 3D. I certainly see it in the younger guys in the office. Is that the plan doesn't become as important, and I really enjoy that actually, because they design in 3D, but I still work in plan and section to a point. I know I don't look that old, but I'm kind of getting on a bit. And so it's in terms of the kind of the process of making architecture, we tend to make everything in models and 3D. And then, you know, myself and several other people who went to the Mac come along and apply a grid. And I think that's a normal process, but I think you'll find that, you know, Hopkins, for instance, would always use a grid, and there are other architects that use grids kind of quite aggressively to make their architecture. And I think I think great architecture is born of that. I think for us, it's kind of a slightly more plastic, but on this particular project, with the 60 by 60 grid, and I always say this when we work on smaller projects, is, we always get a proper survey done early, and rather than measuring up. 20 mil in these spaces can make all the difference. And actually, by making a grid at 60 by 60, you can then actually start to draw. And for the younger people in the office, they can then actually start to see how 60 mil can change the whole layout. For instance, I'll just give you an example. And it comes down to another question which was asked, which is about cost. The screens were on the first floor, although it's only a small idea, were on the front face of the mezzanine. Very difficult to detail against, to get blackout blinds into the bedroom, across, and then down into the stair. So and then we were looking at how the office worked inside. So then the thought was, well, let's move the screen back. But because we're using a 60 mil by 60 mil grid, rather than just pushing and pulling it about in SketchUp or in Revit, you could then actually really think about those depths and really think about how that space worked. And I know it's a small project and there's small blocks, but that kind of critical thinking about what spaces are used for, and that kind of the granular nature, quite literally granular nature of making architecture, is where I certainly love making buildings from. I'd like to think we still make buildings rather than put buildings together, which I think is a distinction. So we'll continue to make buildings and make buildings on grids, but also through a plastic kind of three-dimensional playfulness.
Thanks, Phil. So before I ask you, Ian, I think maybe we ask Richie to continue with your presentation. Richie, I'm sorry that we lost you for a while.
That's all right.
I don't know if you'd like to just talk about the Holton Studios project, and then we can carry on with the questions, maybe.
No problem. Yeah, sorry about that. As soon as I shared my screen, I was staring at a blinking orange light. No connection. Right, okay, I'll try again. So our Holton Studios project, it's located in a small business park on the edge of the village of Huntley-Clay, near Grimsby in Lincolnshire. The site itself, there's a few images just there, is actually where we are based. So the existing building you can see on the photographs there is our studio is housed in there. So the development around our building obviously will impact us and our outlook and what we can see. So the phase that is constructed and complete is phase 1 of potentially 3 phases. It comprises of 6 workspaces, hopefully leading to 32 in total. So on the plan there, you can see P1 is what we've completed, looking at P2, which would be opposite our building now, and then P3 on either side. So adjacent buildings on the business park that we are part of are all quite long, concrete tiled pitch roof buildings constructed in brick with metal roller shutters. We wanted to create a building that found its language not only from the scale of the neighbouring buildings, but also from a more agricultural typology, referencing the surrounding fields and farmsteads synonymous with the Lincolnshire countryside. Our site is literally over the road from fields of corn and other crops and things like that. So we're on the edge of the village. The plan of our building remains linear with a pitched roof. On the communal side of the building is a cantilevered roof that creates a covered public walkway along its length, providing sheltered access to each of the individual studios. With reference to agricultural construction techniques, the building is essentially a galvanized portal frame that has been overclad inside and out with standard sized sheet materials. All of the sheets are mechanically fixed so that they can be removed with minimum disruption to the fabric of the building. And where possible, we try to utilize dry building techniques for simplicity, speed of construction when compared to more traditional building methods. The concrete slab, for example, the whole of the ground slab was formed using precast concrete panels that attach to the portal frame, giving us a ready-made form we're pouring concrete into. Something you might typically see used in a modern day grain store, something like that. Externally, across the long elevations of the building, we've got two variants of Equitone fibre cement sheet. Strangely enough, you're sponsored by Equitone today. There's no, we're not in cahoots with them. It's quite a coincidence. Equitone linear to the south-facing elevation is a ribbed board that creates depth across its surface as light moves around the building. Existing trees on that side of the building as well play with the light, and that will change through the day. So you get sort of the light, when it strikes, it becomes a bit more stark, and then as you get a bit more depth and a bit more movement, it creates a different shade on the back. Along the north elevation and the soffit of the overhanging roof, we've got Equitone Natura, which is a smooth board. It's darker and it absorbs more light. It creates a space that's shaded and muted and more atmospheric. The gables of the building are clad in thin larch battens with an Osmo Nordic red stain. The colour was chosen to reflect the many red brick buildings found around the site. The larch also provides a contrast to the harsher, rigid sheet materials used elsewhere, as well as giving the building a crafted and more bespoke feel, a characteristic that we think is important when we are designing, and we try and integrate that into all of our projects. Lincolnshire is famous for its big sky. The colour of the Kingspan sinusoidal roofing sheet was selected to tonally match the galvanised gutters, downpipes, doors and security shutters, whilst also blending with the sky above as much as possible. Behind the sliding galvanised steel security shutters along the covered north elevation are large proportion windows and glazed entrance doors, the dimensions of which are defined by the standard sheet size of the Equitone panels that flank the openings on either side. The doors and windows are made from Accoya, selected for its strength and longevity. We did originally look at a steel framed window system, but felt that something a bit more bespoke in timber would bring a softer touch to an element of the building that people would interact with on a daily basis. Internally, the studios are lined in sheets of birch face ply, providing a warm contrast to the harsher agricultural materials used outside. The portal form of the building can be read internally as the ceilings are vaulted. Galvanized steel pendant lights and surface fixed service trunking allow a greater deal of adaptability to the spaces, whilst referencing the materials used externally. With adaptability in mind, the internal party walls have been constructed to allow the units to become interconnected should a business require a larger space to work. Each unit is provided with an accessible WC and kitchenette, again lined in birch face ply, with the kitchen units manufactured from the same material. We feel that the timber interior provides a softer ambience in contrast to the utilitarian feeling of the external facades, creating a pleasant working environment. I'm going to jump back to the plan. The impact of the development on ourselves, we wanted to create a communal space in the centre of the site that we obviously look out onto and could be used by other tenants as well within the units. So moving forward, they're not there at the minute, but moving forward, once the other phases take place, we want to landscape in the centre, bringing in possibly some acer trees, something a bit more vivid, so that it creates an interest in the centre. And I think that covers what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Richie. That's great. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions. I mean, I think probably I already started asking some questions. So I might actually continue with the sort of question I was asking Phil, but maybe for you, this idea of using standard materials or, you know, off the shelf? Find that, is that a, I don't know, is that a method of working or design that you've used on other projects, or was that specifically for this, being in a more utilitarian mode, or you know?
I think it was exaggerated on this one because of the approach that we took, looking more at this agricultural sort of feel and design. Trying to think, as much as possible, if in any projects we're using a plywood sheet, for example, or an MDF board, we will adapt designs and plans marginally to fit specific sizes. I suppose one, in that it's essentially less work for a joiner, for a builder, but also it provides more rationale, and there's a reason behind the board being that width, and there's a reason we've got 6 of them, for example, in this particular length of wall. So yeah, I think we adapt to a size, or we will change the size of all of the boards to be equal and fit. But with this project in particular, the length of the building is set out to a full sheet of the Equitone. The windows are all the same width as the Equitone. The shutters in front are all the same width as an Equitone panel. On the inside, window heights, one door is a full sheet of ply. So yeah, it definitely
use it as a tool of design in a way, or at least you
yes.
start to use that as a yeah.
It definitely drives design decisions. Yeah.
Interesting. So I'm going to go back in a way to this idea of measurement, and I know that the module you used for the teaching and learning center, is that where did that come from, out of interest? Or I mean, obviously that's on a much larger scale, but sort of how that was generated, or
I think it was there was probably 2 or 3 things in the back of our mind right from the beginning of the project, and one was that, you know, Durham as an institution has a fantastic history, a stunning setting, and some really great architecture around its campus, and I think that it was in the process of rethinking itself and reinventing itself, and how it was going to portray itself to the world. We felt it was really important that there was an element of the kind of the classic rather than classical about the building, that it wasn't necessarily an exuberant kind of, to use a horrible overused word, iconic kind of iconoclastic building. It was something that was very much kind of recognised in the status of the university. So that drove us down certain material choices. I think the other thing we were conscious of is the way that the building was going to be delivered, and being selfish, we wanted to really kind of exert as much control over the finished product as we could, despite the fact that we wouldn't be the ones actively drawing the 1 to 5 details at every single junction towards the end of the process. So that led us to, as I say, a material choice, but also quite a rational. It sounds strange to describe the building as rational when it's got such a dramatic kind of roof form to it, but the basis of that was this one module, and the locations and sizes of the window openings, and then the kind of tartan grid that formed through the plan really helped us to set out everything and preempt many of the decisions that needed to be taken at the more detailed stages. But also, a head detail is a head detail, a sill detail is a sill detail, a jamb detail is a jamb detail, and we really wanted to minimise the number of instances that would need to be drawn, that would need to be understood and constructed, really to maintain that control, I guess.
Great, thank you. And I just thought there's a couple of questions come in actually, around from Melanie Davis, on from James Hartnett, about the life cycle. Could you talk a bit more about the life cycle assessment of determining various materials, but also as a specific slide, I don't know, whole life cost with from from Durham University. It was just, yeah, maybe you could talk more about the life cycle assessment for the project in terms of materials.
Yeah, I think the life cycle costing exercises that were done were focused on. There was a lot of attention on the roof at all stages. Clearly, it was the most kind of easily identifiable and perhaps least conventional part of the building. So, as you'd expect, it was, there was a lot of attention on the value that was offering. The life cycle costing exercise we did was a requirement of the university. It was part of the BRIAM process, but it was particularly important for the roof to really build the confidence of the client team and everyone else involved in the project that what we were showing was offering the value that they needed to offer. So that was an important point. I think in terms of life cycle, one of the things that we've really taken away from this project and learned and tried to we're trying to apply as we move through future projects is the life cycle in terms of cost, but also in terms of carbon and the value of aligning the design life of the systems and the materials to the overall design life of the building. Rather than designing buildings which are designed to last 50 years and cladding them in materials that have a life of 20, and effectively in terms of carbon, you've got 3 facades through the life of that building. This building, that focus on low maintenance and low through life cost actually translates into a really sensible attitude to carbon as well, which I think we've all learned a lot from applying that, really. Muted.
I don't know if you could comment about life cycle assessment. Do you do that? Do you do this more and more on your projects? I was interested in terms of how you choose projects, how you choose materials now, in terms of the whole embodied carbon side of things as well. It's whether that, it'd be interesting to know how that's coming into the projects that you're working on now, or on these specific projects.
Who are you talking to, Rob?
Either of you, Phil or Richie, if you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk. There was another question here about Grenfell earlier, about kind of the building safety and what have you, and we are finding that I've always had a bit of an issue with concrete outdoors in Britain, and concrete and timber outdoors in Britain anyway, because you never quite know how it moves. You never quite know how it's going to look. It doesn't look that great after some time. I think I got that off Ian Ritchie a long time ago, who doesn't tend to like warping and weaving of timber externally on buildings. That's not to say that it can work, and there's plenty of great buildings and sustainable buildings that go that way. But it's not a particular route that our office is moving in. We're more to do with metals and meshes, which actually in this particular environment may be a safer way to move towards. So we haven't had to change that much. But one thing, we have actually designed a timber building recently, a glulam elliptical building for City University, which has got planning, but has unfortunately been delayed. One thing that we have found, just maybe not in direct answer to your question, Rob, but more to the question that was on the Q&A, is we are finding that the issues that we're having with Grenfell and the safety is then percolating down into our PI, our procurement routes, especially D&B, where after stage 2 you're looking to get help from the contractors, who then are not so willing because those individual subcontractors can't get PI, or the PI is getting very, very expensive. So it seems that PI is, I think we all know that professional indemnity insurance is rising fast. It'd be interesting to see whether we can actually get it in a couple of years. I don't know how that's going to happen. So we were using a timber building glulam that we needed the industry's help with. we were finding it difficult, and the client was passing that responsibility down to us, and there were a few kind of strong discussions around that. And I think that's going to continue. So I think just in terms of what we're specifying, how we're specifying, building out of CLT, for instance, there's an awful lot of CLT going on in terms of multi-story buildings and people being concerned about how that's going to be affected. So there's a kind of a balance between procurement and delivery and insurance, and also sustainability, which of course timber is a great sustainable material for structure, against the questions which are going to rise out of this building safety bill. So, I mean, that's around thinking on those things. But I think all of those things then feed back into the kind of projects that we make. Because, you know, we designed an elliptical glulam building with a kind of a bird's nest geometry. And we were being asked to detail it up without any help from the industry, based on PI. And then you think to yourself, well, maybe I should have just done a square box out of render where I could put standard windows in. Now, of course, that's the polarity of it, but there's a truth to actually architects thinking about the kind of buildings you want to make in a world where we're not quite sure about the insurance, and a world where we're not quite sure where procurement is going, which is why I think procurement is such a big issue in the RIBA presidential conversation at the moment as well. It's a big issue, and it affects cost and the kind of architecture that we want to make.
And Richie, I don't know if you want to comment on any of that, or there's also a couple of questions come in. I know one from here is from Christopher Coggins about how did you approach fire protection for the internal wood surfaces?
So the internal wood surfaces, we sort of treat them in this project as very much as a dressing, as a veneer for those internal walls. So the structure and the build-up behind that timber is obviously a robust detail, fully fire compliant. As I said, the timber itself isn't structural within those walls or anything else. It's purely a dressing. So I think behind those walls we've got 2 layers of standard jumbo studs lined in 2 layers of sound check board, providing an hour fire protection on those. So yeah, very much treated as a dressing rather than a structural element in that regard. Yeah.
It's also asking here, did the large external feature need fire rating? I think that's the...
I don't believe so. It's finished in a stain, but again, it's a dressing on a batten. Could be completely removed from the structure, and the structure would still stand. So no, I don't believe so.
Let's see what other questions have come in. And just one more for you. I think this is about flexibility. Can you, great to hear the party walls can be disassembled on the project, or disassembled, I suppose. Can you explain how this is achieved, or how was that flexibility built in between the different units?
Yeah, so the units originally, I believe this regulation's changed now, but when we first started looking at this, there was a set size that would keep you under the threshold for certain business rates. So we were working with that in mind to create these units. They're all approximately 55 square meters. The end 2 are slightly bigger. But there was this conversation about, well, what if someone wants more space? So the portal frame obviously is what it is. The internal party walls don't support that portal frame structure. So you could essentially take all of them out and have one large shed if that's what you wanted. So within those party walls, we've got lintels in place so that basically 2 of our ply panels can be taken away, and you could have double doors. So there's already lintels in place behind that dressing to create doorways. Or, as I said, if someone did wish, they could take the whole of the internal wall out. The fire protection, yeah, it's all in place, ready for those walls to come away if that's the wish of the tenant, basically.
And there's a question came in from Tarek about 3D software. Which 3D software all of you use? Be interesting to just to know, to hear. As a Ian, what?
We use Revit.
Yeah.
Increasingly, we're using Enscape as well as a kind of live visualization tool. So, you know, there's been a proliferation of 2 screens around the office over the last couple of years, I think. And, you know, you walk around and you see a lot of people are designing, and, you know, Phil mentioned it earlier, kind of working in plan potentially in Revit, but also, you know, the live visualization that you can get through plugins like Enscape is really valuable.
Well, we've really streamlined our office. We use SketchUp, Rhino, Enscape, Revit. We use VR. We use a pencil every now and then, and we're also we're doing a further education project in Norwich at the moment for Norwich City College, Digitech, and we're doing a research project using Microsoft HoloLens, which you can move all of your 3D models around and share design ideas in 3D space. So I think, you know, importantly now when we're all working away in our own homes, our thoughts on the software that we use and the way that we interact is changing fast. So I think, you know, those kinds of digital HoloLens stuff, VR, being able to move around on digital boards it can only be helpful, and it's a big question at the moment. But yeah, I still fall back to SketchUp a lot because it's quick, it's easy, and then if I draw it really badly, I get somebody else to put it into Revit for me.
What about you, Richie?
Yeah, we're very much tried and tested AutoCAD 2D and SketchUp for our 3D models, and then maybe a bit of tinkering in Photoshop for any visuals or any renders that come out of SketchUp. We are sort of looking into more of a Revit or a BIM sort of package, but we've not made that transition yet. So I don't know, very much 2D CAD and SketchUp 3D.
I think, I don't know, we've probably got a time for a couple more questions, but I'm just seeing if there's a question here, Phil, about acoustics in the scheme. Just how did you design any absorption into the
yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit like when you design. I once helped design the IMAX cinema for my sins down at Waterloo, and a couple of theatres. And the difference is of course when people move into a theatre, they bring absorption themselves. And I think if you were to take a photograph now of John's house, it looked very different to the way the photographs look at the present. So absorption comes with living, and I think people will bring that in. That's not to say that we don't think about acoustics a lot. You know, the sound of walking on the timber is I've been looking a lot into video recently, and it's a fact that you hear sound before you see. So if you're watching a movie, sound will have more effect on your feeling than the visual does, which I thought was quite an interesting point. And there's something about listening to people walking on a timber floor. I imagine it's quite tinny in there until John and Karen moved in. But another example, down at the British Film Institute, we used woven wire phosphor bronze mesh, which is only 10% acoustic absorption, but above that we put acoustic insulation, and used it to different extents across the space to make spaces more casual, with more reflectance and more absorption in other areas where there was more serious work going on. So we do consider it consistently across projects. I guess with residential projects, we kind of build a framework for life that we think is kind of can last a long time. You asked the question about why use timber. to me, architecture is all about enclosure. It's about sound. It's about light, but it's also about kind of how, you know, every little bit of space that we make, we get light in, and it's part of the cosmos, and you kind of sit inside that cave. So I think somebody said it was architectural whimsy to put some blocks on the ceiling, which probably doesn't help the acoustics either. But I don't mind a bit of architectural whimsy. I think you know, architecture needs a bit of wit in it, a bit of not necessarily humour, but a little bit of humour possibly. Wit makes people look, and if you look and you're more connected to your environment, then you might care a little bit more for it. That's one thing I've learned from travelling around the world. So if you observe your environment, you will care more for it. So whether that be through sound or through visuals or through material or through light, if you can bring a bit of wit and make people look, then it's good for well-being, it's good for the environment, whether it be tinny noise or not. I've answered about 6 questions in that, probably not very well, but there we go.
Thanks. And I just thought I'd ask you, Ian and Ian, about the acoustics at the centre, in terms of particularly those upper spaces, the learning common spaces, and how you dealt with that, because obviously each of those spaces are slightly differently modelled with their ceilings, and I was just interested in how you'd approach that.
We had a very good acoustician working on the project right the way through. I think in the lower, we haven't focused on the teaching spaces, but in general, that's a kind of semi-exposed soffit with a raft ceiling, which I think was I think it was Ecophon, yeah. So they were specified, obviously, for the kind of for the acoustic conditions that we needed for the teaching spaces. And whilst it's not, whilst the building bulletins guidance is obviously designed for schools, I think they were the main reference point in terms of the teaching spaces. In the learning space, it was really about providing a condition that would support a whole range of different activities, and really it's carpeted throughout the space to deal with some of the potential sort of impact noise, but that soffit was critical. And as Ian said, we started off looking at a sprayed acoustic finish within those spaces. The complexity of the kind of multiple trades that we needed to build that up just really had a major program impact. So the British gypsum board product that was used with an acoustic quilt behind gave us the right kind of category of absorption, and obviously the full ceiling surface was used to kind of maximise the amount of absorption we could get in there. And I think it's fair to say it's worked. It's not a dead space, but it's not. There's a hum of activity in the background, which I think is it's good in a space that's occupied by that many people. But it's it's kind of studious and calm as well at the same time.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we're probably, I'm just going to see if there's any questions come in that we could, I think we'll wrap this up, but there is a question here just about NBS source. Does anybody, is anyone using NBS source? That's just one I've just noticed, but.
Yes, I believe we are. I think we just paid our bill again, so that's why I'm not.
The general specification question. But I think that was fantastic, and I'll probably wrap this up now. So I'd like to thank you all, for all our speakers today, for taking part. That was a really interesting presentation. So thank you, Ian and Ian. Thank you, Richie, and thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone for joining us today. And thanks also to our sponsor, Ecotone, for helping make this event happen. And I do hope you'll join us again for the next webinar, perhaps even in a physical space next time. Thank you very much, and have a good morning.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks.